Imagine the worst thing you've ever said. Now imagine saying it to someone who loved you completely. And imagine they were watching. His name meant rock. Peter, Petros, the one Jesus himself had named, not born with that name but given it, destined, or so everyone believed, to be something unbreakable. And yet, on the coldest night of his life, warming his hands over a stranger's fire, he couldn't even admit to a serving girl that he knew the man he had followed for 3 years. This video is not a Bible lesson. It is not a theology lecture. It is something older and more honest than that. This is a story about the gap between who we say we are and who we are when everything is stripped away. About the moment a person looks at themselves, truly looks, and cannot recognize the face staring back. About guilt and shame, and the strange and terrifying possibility that failure might not be the end of someone's story. If you have ever made a promise and broken it, if you have ever abandoned someone in their worst moment, if you have ever heard your own voice say something and thought, "That was not me, that cannot be me," then this story is about you. From dust we came, and sometimes it is only when we return to dust that we discover what we are truly made of. Jerusalem in the spring. The year is roughly 33 of the Common Era. The city is full, dangerously full. The Feast of Passover has drawn pilgrims from across the Roman world, and the streets that were empty 2 weeks ago now press with bodies, languages, the smell of roasting lamb and incense and fear. It is late, perhaps past midnight, perhaps closer to 3 in the morning. The olive trees on the slope east of the city are old, some of them centuries old, and their gnarled roots press into stone as if holding the earth together. This garden, this place called Gethsemane, meaning oil press, is quiet now in a way that feels wrong. Something has happened here. Something is still happening. There are torches coming through the trees, and soldiers, and one familiar face walking among the soldiers, a face the others know. A man named Simon, who was renamed Peter, watches as his teacher is bound. He reaches for a sword. He cuts off the ear of a servant. Jesus stops him, quietly, without anger, and heals the man Peter has wounded. And then the soldiers lead Jesus away, and the disciples scatter. Pause. All of them, every single one. But Peter doesn't quite disappear. He follows at a distance. That phrase, "at a distance," appears in all 3 accounts that mention it. At a distance, close enough to still call himself a follower, far enough to deny it if asked. It is cold, the kind of cold that seeps through sandals and through cloaks and into the bones of a man who has been awake for 20 hours and is running on adrenaline and dread. And there is a fire, a small fire, burning in the open courtyard outside the house of the high priest Caiaphas. Servants and officers have built it for warmth. And Peter, not sure why, perhaps not even fully deciding to do it, walks over and joins them. He stands there, warming his hands over the coals. Anthrakia, the Greek word for charcoal fire. He didn't know, standing there, that this specific kind of fire, anthrakia, would be used only one other time in the entire New Testament. That the next time someone wrote that word, it would be the smell of Peter's redemption. But that is later. Right now it is just cold. And someone is about to ask him a question. To understand what happens in that courtyard, you have to understand who Peter believed he was. He was a fisherman from Galilee, rough hands, direct manner, a man who understood nets and weather and the language of hard physical labor. He was not educated in the way that mattered in Jerusalem. He was not a scribe. He was not a Pharisee. But Jesus had chosen him, and not just chosen, named him. "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, translated, means Peter, the rock. Imagine what that does to a man. To be looked at by someone, truly looked at, as if they can see through skin and bone and habit, and to be told not what you are but what you will be. That is a gift so enormous it can become a burden. Because Peter believed it. He believed it completely. At the Last Supper, when Jesus told the disciples they would all stumble that night, all of them, everyone, Peter answered immediately, impulsively, the way he always did. Even if all the others stumble because of you, I never will. There is something deeply recognizable in that moment. That particular kind of courage that comes from never having been truly tested. The boldness of someone who hasn't yet met the worst version of themselves. Jesus looked at him. I tell you the truth. This very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter shook his head. Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And every disciple at that table said the same thing. He meant it. That is the heartbreaking part. He absolutely meant it. There is a pattern in human psychology that researchers call overconfidence bias, a tendency to believe that our values and our identity are so fixed that they will hold under any pressure, that our good intentions will translate into good actions when the moment comes. But the data from psychology, from neuroscience, from millennia of human history tells a different story. We are not the authors of our actions as much as we believe. We are also the products of context, of temperature, of fear, of the crowd around us. Peter did not know this about himself. He was about to. But before Peter could be broken, he had to be willing to fight. Before Gethsemane, Jesus said something strange. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Like wheat, the image is of grain being violently shaken. Chaff and substance separated, nothing gentle about it. It is a test that reveals what is real and what was only the appearance of substance. Jesus knew. He had known for months, possibly longer, that Peter's great confidence was resting on an untested foundation, that the rock had not yet been weighed. And instead of protecting Peter from the test, instead of simply refusing Satan's request, Jesus allowed it. Because some things can only be learned in the breaking. 3 times that night, Jesus returned to find Peter and the others sleeping. 3 times he asked them to stay awake, to pray. And 3 times they slept. There is irony in those 3s. The same number as the coming denials. As if the failure in the garden and the failure in the courtyard were one continuous event, a single falling that had already begun. You could not watch 1 hour? Peter was not lazy. He was exhausted, emotionally overwhelmed, and spiritually unprepared. Not because he was a bad man, but because he had not prayed. He had chosen confidence over vulnerability. He had chosen the armor of his own certainty over the admission that he needed help holding himself together. How many of us have done the same thing? Walked into a difficult conversation believing our good intentions would be enough. Trusted the idea of who we are rather than doing the work of becoming that person. Skipped the quiet, unglamorous preparation and then wondered why we crumbled when the moment arrived. And then the torches came through the trees. Peter was jarred awake. He saw the soldiers. He saw Judas walking with them. And something surged in him, not calculated bravery, but reactive animal protectiveness. He reached for a sword. He cut off the ear of a man named Malchus, the servant of the high priest. It's a small, strange detail. Of all the people in that armed crowd, the only one Peter wounds is a servant. Not a soldier, not a Pharisee, not the high priest. A servant. Jesus healed the man immediately, quietly, and then he said to Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" The sword, dramatic, visible, heroic. The cup, quiet, invisible, surrendered. Peter understood swords. He did not yet understand cups. The disciples scattered, all of them, into the darkness, into the olive trees, into the surrounding hills. And Peter followed at a distance, Those 3 words contain a whole universe of internal conflict. He had sworn he would die with Jesus. He had picked up a sword to prove it. And now he was following, but not too closely. Present enough to still believe in his own loyalty. Distant enough to maintain the option of escape. That ambivalent distance, that half-commitment, is perhaps the most human thing in the entire story. And it was in that half-committed space that the question finally came. The courtyard of the high priest's house. Stone walls, torches at intervals. The murmur of people, servants, guards, officials, gathered in the cold night. And near the center, a small fire burning. Anthrachia. Peter pressed through the outer gate. He had managed to get in through the connection of another disciple who knew the high priest's household. He was inside enemy territory, and he was trying not to be noticed. He moved toward the fire, because it was cold, because he was frightened, because human beings under stress reach for warmth. A servant girl looked at him. She was young. She was nobody in particular. She was not a soldier or a priest or a judge. She was just someone who recognized his face. You also were with Jesus of Galilee. That's all. Not an accusation, not a threat, an observation, and Peter's mouth opened before his mind could catch up. I don't know what you're talking about. He moved toward the gateway. Maybe he was trying to leave. Maybe he was just trying to create physical distance between himself and the question. A rooster crowed somewhere in the pre-dawn city, and another servant girl saw him. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. This time, Peter added an oath. I don't know the man. Notice the escalation. First denial, vague ignorance, perhaps deniable even to himself. I don't know what you're talking about. Second denial, with an oath, a deliberate, formal statement. God has witnessed that this is true. Third denial. After someone recognized his Galilean accent, the one thing he couldn't change about himself, the trace of his origin woven into every word he spoke. Peter began to call down curses on himself. I don't know the man. He didn't even say the name. Scholars who study the sociology of denial call what happened to Peter mimetic contagion, the psychological pull to conform to a hostile crowd, to adopt the right opinions, to shed an identity that marks you as dangerous in that moment. But there is something more personal happening too. The French philosopher René Girard described moments like this as being possessed by the crowd, when the pressure of a group is so total, so immediate, so physical, that the self dissolves into what the crowd demands. Peter wasn't lying in those moments in the way a deliberate deceiver lies. He was surviving, or rather, the part of him that was wired for survival was acting before the part of him that was wired for love and loyalty could catch up. We like to think of ourselves as the authors of our actions. We like to believe that character is fixed and stable, that who we are in the quiet moments is exactly who we will be in the loud ones. But character is not a wall. It is a practice, and a practice that has been abandoned, that has not been sustained through prayer, through preparation, through honest self-knowledge, will crack under pressure. Not because we are bad people, but because we are human people. Have you ever heard your own voice say something and thought, where did that come from? That wasn't me. That couldn't be me. Could be, and it was. The rooster crowed, and in the sound of one bird's cry, 30 years of a man's life collapsed into a single moment. Only Luke records what happened next. The other gospel writers tell us the rooster crowed, that Peter remembered Jesus' words, and that he went outside and wept bitterly. But Luke adds one detail that changes everything. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Think about that. In that moment, Jesus was a prisoner. He was bound. He had been struck. He was in the middle of a mock trial that would end in crucifixion. He had every reason to be consumed by his own suffering, and he turned and looked at Peter. What was in that look? Scholars across centuries have wrestled with this. The text does not say it was anger. It does not say it was disappointment. Luke does not tell us what was in the eyes of Jesus. He tells us only that Peter saw it, and that it broke him. He went outside and wept bitterly. The Greek is a klausen pikros, a weeping from the gut. Not grief's quiet tears, but the kind of crying that comes when a person's image of themselves has been completely destroyed, and what remains is too raw and too real to contain. There is a precise clinical distinction in modern psychology between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Guilt is painful, but it points outward, toward the act, toward the other person, toward the possibility of repair. Shame turns inward. It doesn't say I made a mistake. It says I am a mistake. Standing outside that gate, Peter was not simply feeling guilty about 3 denials. He was experiencing the collapse of a self. The man who was called the Rock had discovered that he was not made of stone. And that discovery, that gap between who he believed he was and who he had actually been, is one of the most devastating human experiences there is. And yet, he wept. Judas also felt anguish. Judas also knew he had done something terrible. But Judas took his anguish and turned it inward, weaponized it against himself, and found no exit from the verdict he had already rendered on his own soul. Peter wept. And weeping, real weeping, the kind that doesn't perform or explain, is not the same as giving up. Sometimes it is the first honest thing a person has done in a very long time. The tears of Peter were not the sound of a man breaking permanently. They were the sound of something finally cracking open. But before the opening could become something new, Peter would have to survive the silence. We do not know exactly where Peter was during those 3 days. We know that Jesus was crucified the following morning. We know that some of the disciples watched from a distance, and that some of the women stayed close. We know that the men were largely hidden, afraid, the doors locked against a city that had just killed their teacher. But we do not have Peter's account of those 3 days. What we can reconstruct from what we know about human psychology and human grief is something like this. He had denied Jesus before the crucifixion, which means he had to live through the crucifixion carrying that knowledge. He didn't just lose someone he loved, he lost someone he had betrayed, someone who had looked at him with eyes full of something that couldn't be anger, even though anger would have been easier. There is a specific quality to the guilt of the living when someone they have wronged dies before reconciliation can happen. It is a sealed room. The wrong is complete. There is no going back to it, no finishing the conversation, no getting the chance to say what needs to be said. Have you ever carried that kind of unfinished thing? Peter carried it for 3 days inside a locked room in Jerusalem, while outside the city continued its Passover and the Romans went about their business and the stone over the tomb did not move. After the resurrection, the disciples encountered Jesus on 2 occasions in Jerusalem. We know Peter was present. We know something passed between them, though the Gospels give us only the barest outline. But then Peter made a decision. I'm going fishing, he said. Before Jesus, Peter was a fisherman. The call, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men, had changed the direction of his entire life. And now, on the other side of the worst thing he had ever done, he was reaching back toward the only identity that had never asked anything of him that he couldn't deliver. The sea didn't know what he had done. The nets didn't judge. The fish didn't look at him with eyes full of something he couldn't name. The others went with him. 6 other disciples, following Peter into a boat, because even broken, even self-exiled back to the familiar, Peter was the kind of person others followed. They fished all night. They caught nothing. And when the gray dawn came up over the hills of Galilee, there was a figure standing on the shore. And this figure had already built a fire. The Greek word for what Jesus built on that shore was anthrakia, a charcoal fire. The same word. The only other time in the entire New Testament this specific word is used. The same smell, the same warmth, the same flickering orange against pre-dawn darkness. If you were Peter, if you had spent weeks carrying the memory of a night in a cold courtyard, warming your hands over coals while you were telling the worst lies of your life, and you came ashore in the morning light and smelled that smell, what would that do to you? John tells us that when the other disciple recognized the figure on the shore and said, "It is the Lord," Peter, who was fishing naked as fishermen did, wrapped his outer garment around himself and jumped into the water. He didn't wait for the boat. He didn't calculate the appropriateness. He jumped. That jump, impulsive, ridiculous, soaking, desperate, is perhaps the most Peter moment in all of Scripture. The same impulsiveness that had reached for a sword. The same impulsiveness that had promised undying loyalty at the Last Supper. The same impulsiveness that would one day walk on water and then immediately sink. But this time, the impulsiveness was aimed correctly. This time it was not toward a sword, but toward the only thing that mattered. Jesus had already made breakfast. That detail, "Jesus had already made breakfast," says something that no theological argument could say more clearly. He wasn't waiting to interrogate Peter. He wasn't preparing a judgment. He was cooking fish on a charcoal fire, waiting for wet, exhausted fishermen to come ashore so he could feed them. They ate in silence at first. Nobody asked who it was. They knew. And in that knowing, in that eating together before any word of restoration was spoken, there was a kind of grace that moves faster than language. And then, when the meal was finished, Jesus turned to Peter. Not to the group, to Peter. He used his old name. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Not Peter, not the rock. Simon, the name before the name. The name before the great promise and the great failure. As if to say, "I see you beneath all of it, and I am asking, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs." The second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Take care of my sheep." The third time. John writes that Peter was grieved because Jesus asked him a third time. And in that grief is the recognition. One for each denial. One question for each time Peter had said, "I don't know the man." But Jesus was not torturing him. He was healing him. Modern psychology has a concept called exposure therapy. The idea that healing from trauma sometimes requires returning to the site of the wound, not to relive the pain, but to create a new memory in the same location. To overwrite the sensory record. Jesus had not read psychology textbooks, but he understood the human soul completely. 3 denials by a charcoal fire. 3 affirmations by a charcoal fire. The same smell, the same warmth, the same flickering orange light. But this time, instead of "I don't know the man," "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep." The restoration was not just forgiveness, as if Jesus had simply stamped a pardon and handed it over. The restoration was recommissioning. Peter was not just forgiven of failure. He was given purpose that could only come from his failure, only flow through what he had broken and what had been rebuilt. How can a person lead others to forgiveness if they themselves have never needed it? And what Peter became after that morning is perhaps the most astonishing part of the whole story. Weeks later, Jerusalem, the same city, the same streets where servants in a courtyard had recognized his accent. The same people, many of the same people who had chanted for crucifixion, and Peter stood up. not hiding, not following at a distance, not warming his hands at someone else's fire hoping no one would recognize him. He stood up before thousands. Some estimates say the Pentecost crowd numbered in the tens of thousands, and he preached. He preached the name of Jesus, openly, boldly, in the city where saying that name had cost Jesus his life just weeks before, to people who may have been in that courtyard, who may have stood outside Pilate's balcony screaming for blood. The man who could not admit knowing Jesus to a servant girl with a candle, that same man now stood in the open air of Jerusalem and accused his audience of crucifying the Messiah. This Jesus, whom you crucified, God has made him both Lord and Christ. 3,000 people, the text tells us, were cut to the heart that day. 3,000 became followers. And the movement that Peter helped birth that morning in Jerusalem would, within 3 centuries, reshape the entire Roman Empire. I want you to sit with that contrast for a moment, because there is something that does not make sense about it if you're working with a simple understanding of character. The fearful, crumbling, servant girl denying Peter, and the fearless, fire descended, thousands converting Peter. These are not two different men. They are the same man, the same hands, the same Galilean accent, the same impulsive, over-promising heart. What changed? Some theologians would say the Holy Spirit, and there is truth in that. But there is also something psychological happening that we can understand without requiring any particular belief system. Peter had looked at the absolute worst version of himself. Not the version in his imagination, but the version in the real world under real pressure, and he had survived the looking. He had been shattered, and he had been put back together. Not restored to who he was before, but transformed into someone who now carried the memory of his own fragility as a foundation rather than a flaw. The man who had never failed could be dangerous because he had never learned his own edges. He could make bold promises he couldn't keep. He could fight with swords when cups were needed. The man who had failed and been forgiven and been restored, that man knew something different. He knew the weight of the worst moment. He knew that the love which had looked at him in the courtyard had not collapsed under the weight of what he'd done. And that knowledge, not courage, not ability, not charisma, is what made him able to stand. There is a theological tradition that says Peter's failures were not incidental to his greatness. They were foundational to it. That the rock the church was built upon was not a man who had never cracked, but a man who had cracked completely and then been reforged. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, Jesus had said to him back before any of this. And what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. He said this to Simon, before the failure, before the tears, before the charcoal fire and the 3 questions and the jump from the fishing boat. As if he already knew what Peter would need to go through to become who he was meant to be. The church historian Origen records that Peter, when it was time for him to die, crucified by Nero, the same Rome that had tried Jesus, requested to be crucified upside down. He said he was not worthy to die in the same way as his Lord. The man who could not admit knowing Jesus to a servant girl with a candle died on a cross, inverted, still proclaiming the name. Not because he had become someone who never felt fear, but because he had stood in the worst of himself and discovered that grace was waiting on the other side. We began with a question. Imagine the worst thing you've ever said. Now imagine saying it to someone who loved you completely, and imagine they were watching. Most of us don't need to imagine it. We have lived some version of it. Perhaps not as dramatic as a cold courtyard and a crowing rooster. But the anatomy of Peter's failure, the gap between who we say we are and who we are under pressure, the lie that comes out before we've even decided to lie, the self that collapses when the crowd is hostile, that anatomy is not 2,000 years old. It is as recent as this morning. What Peter's story offers us is not comfort in the sense of erasure. It does not say, it's fine, it doesn't matter. It says something harder, something more honest. It happened. It was real. And it is not the last word. The distinction between guilt and shame is not a small one. Guilt says I did something wrong, and I can act differently. Shame says I am something wrong, and there is no exit. Peter wept in guilt. He didn't dissolve in shame, at least not permanently. And what pulled him back from that edge was not his own will, not his own determination to be better. It was a look, a fire on a beach, a breakfast made before the conversation. 3 questions asked not to reopen wounds but to close them from the inside. Pause. The French theologian Bernard of Clairvaux once wrote that there are 3 things that precede love: the wound, the search for the doctor, and the willingness to be touched. Peter had the wound. Jesus was the doctor. And at some point between the locked room in Jerusalem and the jump from the fishing boat, Peter chose to be touchable. I want to leave you with a question not to answer but to carry. What would it mean for you in your own life, in your own story, to stand before the charcoal fire again? Not to relive the failure, but to accept that the person who knows about the failure has already built the fire and made the breakfast and is standing on the shore, waiting. What would it mean to jump out of the boat? We are all, in some way, Simon before the name was given, broken and beloved, crumbled and called. From dust we came, and it is in the returning to dust, in the shattering, in the weeping, in the cold courtyard at 3 in the morning, that we sometimes discover the only things in us that were ever truly indestructible. If this journey moved something in you, if some part of Peter's story felt uncomfortably familiar, I'd love to know which moment landed hardest for you. Was it the overconfidence at the Last Supper, the silence of those 3 days, or the fire on the beach? Leave your answer in the comments below. Conversations like that are why this channel exists. If you're new here, welcome. Sons of Dust exists to explore the full weight of the human experience inside ancient stories. If that resonates with you, consider subscribing and turning on the bell. Every video is a deep dive, and none of them are rushed. Next time on Sons of Dust, we go to a very different kind of breaking. A man in a dungeon. A faith that has stopped making sense. A question sent to the only person who might have the answer. John the Baptist at the edge of doubt. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. From dust we came, and to dust we shall return.